I looked at her paintings in the Perth Museum. My goodness, they were wonderful, accurate paintings. There were diagrams of spores germinating, things that no one was doing at that time. I put everything behind me about Peter Rabbit and started to look at Beatrix Potter and what she had done. And I was amazed at the ability of this lady to paint a mushroom, but also put all the details which allow you to identify it accurately. Even now, one can look at them and say, oh, that's XY, because it's so accurately done. She was a wonderful artist, but also, most important, she was an incredible observer. And so her paintings, they illuminate compared with the paintings which are available at that time of what? 1850, 1860. She was a wonderful person.
Describe Beatrix Potter's ability to illustrate fungi.
I think really she was stirred by the Highland matron that she had at Dalgai's house, because she talked about folklore, who was talking about fairies and so, because if you look at some of her later writings, she talks about fairies and talks about fungi in connection with them. So it was her that stimulated her to look at things in nature, whether it be fungi or other organisms. And then I think the pinnacle of this association was Charlie Mackintosh, who was a postman at the house for a long time. And she used to know him as a young child, and both being shy people used to hide from each other so they wouldn't meet. But in the end, she got enough courage and he was persuaded for the two to meet, and they found that they had a common feature together. They loved fungi. And so all these letters that went backwards and forwards, all these specimens which went backwards and forwards between Charlie Mackintosh and Beatrix on ecology, really genetics, on all sorts of aspects. So she got this interest in fungi and started to paint them. And she painted quite a few when she was about 22. She started to paint them regularly as they regularly appeared. And it was her father's friend, the painter Milanus, who said, this lady has got a talent. And she had already been in London, where she was born. She went to an art teacher who taught her how to illustrate. So she put all these things together and started to illustrate her findings. This is the first ones that she found in the Lake District. And we know it, of course, as the hedgehog.
Yes.
And the lower one is the candle fungus. But you'll notice there, they are just simply portraits. Now, some years later, she met this Charlie Mackintosh again, who was a very shy man, but he was able to persuade to go to Burnham, where they were then staying. And he said, these are beautiful paintings, but from a scientific point of view, you really ought to put the characters of the gills and the pores in. And she had already said to him, I find it great difficulty. But she started to put them in, and there's an example. Later on, she does a section through the cap and a section through the stem, and the gills exposed.
She's even got the pale gill edge.
Yes.
That's attention to detail, isn't it?
As mycologists, we know that the attachment of the gills is very important in identification. So here we were having a maturing person from the age of 22 for probably 10 years more. She started to illustrate, to become more and more critical about what she put on paper.
You've sort of touched on this, but the next question sort of links into that. How did Beatrix Potter's knowledge develop the more she painted?
I think she wanted to know more about these organisms which suddenly appear. Of course, we're talking about larger fungi, but
yes,
gradually she realised that in the woods and the fields there were many other types of fungi, very small fungi. And when she met George Massey, when she visited him at Kew, he suggested that she should look up microfungi because she was such a good illustrator. There are plenty of books on larger fungi,
yes,
mushrooms and toadstools, but few that actually put down the characters of microscopic fungi. And so she started to develop her interest in illustrating microfungi. And then she started to find that there was an ecological concept where these microfungi and the larger fungi were only growing in particular places.
yes.
And so when she found some of the rarer fungi, she noted where they were found and on what they were found. And there is the old man of the woods. I have a document in her letters. When she found this, she actually puts the trees that it's growing with and the spot that she found it, because it's such a rare fungus that she thought we ought to know where it occurs. Her illustrations are so accurate for her time that we were able to identify rather rare species which we never thought occurred in Scotland before. Stevenson had maybe talked about them but never recorded them, whereas Beatrix was finding them. She was going to a place where other people didn't collect, and as you know, you go somewhere near and you find all sorts of nice things. She was finding these things. Rarities like that were sent to the Reverend Stevenson by Charlie Mackintosh to just check that she was correct. But there are several species that are very rare. You can tell them from the illustrations. So we have these wonderful records too, which she was developing into her mycological knowledge.
How did Beatrix Potter's use of a microscope help with her paintings?
She first of all, I think, borrowed Bertram's microscope. Now Bertram was her brother. He was born 5 years after her. But he had a microscope. She used that and realised that here was an instrument which could be used to help her. So she took some spores, the spore print where the spores fall down from the mushroom, took a few, put them into a drop of water and looked at them under the microscope and realised that they started to grow, germinated, as we would say really, and they would grow and produce hyphae. So she looked at these things and their paintings or drawings in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which showed you that she looked at the development of these spores and the way they germinated. Every 15 minutes she made a note of how they developed. And some of them produced mycelium, which we call this growth. She saw that it fragmented. And those fragments looked like mould. And she asked the question, do larger fungi all have moulds in their life cycle? Quite unknown at the time for people to think like that, but of course they do. So the microscope was helping her again to develop into a fully flown mycologist, because she was then talking about, are there hybrids between fungi? And what is the connection between the larches that I find in Perthshire with little orange fungi on them, which are swollen and produce a blight of the larch tree, and although they're similar to things I find in the south of England, which don't produce these galls and a blight of larch trees. And she was able to find the different species of fungi. She looked more closely into this, and latterly she contacted Charlie and said, will you send me some lichens? Because she started to believe that lichens were a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an alga. Of course, at the time, most British mycologists or naturalists thought that lichens were organisms themselves. Here she was asking Charlie Mackintosh to get her specimens. There it is. Actually, you can see it there. I photographed it and you can see it. Here is Alluria discus, and you see that it has got these orangey spots on. It was a Canadian mycologist who was with me looking at the photographs of the illustrations in the Armagh Museum, and he said, oh, I know what that is. That is the Tramella. That's a parasite of Alluria discus. So here she had drawn the spores because she didn't know it wasn't connected. It was found on as a parasite.
Okay.
And she illustrated this 50 years before it was described as a new species to science.
Amazing.
Yes. This is a photocopy of some letters that I was talking to you about, Mary Noble found in this brown envelope. And you can see here a group of mushrooms all growing from a central point. This was a specimen that was sent by Charlie Mackintosh to Beatrix, and she put it in the airing cupboard and forgot about it.
Okay.
And she grew it up. When she opened the tin, she saw that it was all elongated. The original was the velvet shank, Flammulina veloutepiece that we call now. Usually it occurs in the winter time with a black velvety foot and a nice orangey sticky cap. And it had etiolated. Now, years later, if you can project your mind, you can buy it as
Enoki.
enoki.
Okay, yes.
Etiolated stems of the colibia.
Just like here.
Just like she's drawn. I think she's a loss to science in that nobody appreciated that an amateur woman could be doing this sort of work early on. And then she made money out of Peter Rabbit. It made a lot of money. She became an independent woman, and she became more and more connected with the Lake District. and became an expert in judging Hardwick sheep. No more mycology.
Thank you very much indeed, Roy, for sharing your knowledge about Beatrix Potter. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
You're welcome.